Hey there, Reading 100 students. This screencast will cover lots of the details of the final project that you're working on for this course, which is related to your work with the other Westmore, arriving at an issue that you think teens or adolescents really need to have more information about or feel empowered to take matters into their own hands about. And hopefully it will help you become successful with that project. So remember that the final project is almost like a science fair, but it's a teen resource fair. You'll be at a Boys and Girls Club, and you'll be presenting the research that you find, the facts, the details, the statistics from that research. And the goal is that you want to empower the teens, the adolescents, to make good choices. So in looking at the research that you have collected for your team, you want to think what information will be most helpful. You're not going to present all the information, vomit it onto a poster board. You're going to be selective in assessing what information will be most helpful and then synthesizing, making sense of that information to present it in a meaningful and purposeful way to the teens. The other thing I want you to think about is what information and community resources can they leave with that will have the most impact, and that will appear in your flyer or brochure that they can leave with. And then lastly, I want you to think about how you'll hook them with the game to listen to you in the first place or leave with some impact, depending on how you design things. So, and I apologize for this really crude mock-up of a trifold, but you can imagine your trifold poster of looking something like this, that, you know, in the center is the issue with a catchy title, and you've got some facts, maybe some more facts and some data. Whoops. And then over here, you have maybe some resources, you have your APA style list of references, maybe over here you have some background research that's meaningful and some images to help them visualize the problem and the issue that you're sharing with them. And this is just one example of a mock-up. The examples that I'm about to show you don't necessarily look like this. And then the other piece that you're going to need to design is the game and the brochure. So, you know, think trifold flyer style brochure, or a flyer that's, you know, colorful, that has information on it, and then a game. And the game can be a modification of a board game, a spinner game, a dice game, something like that. It doesn't have to be born of your own creation. You can take a game that is already ready-made and modify it for your issue. And this is what it can look like. So as you can see here, these are some students who did this project prior on gangs and how they lead to death and or incarceration. And over here is part of their game that they had students play. It, I believe, was a trivia game. So they have little note cards, different color-coded note cards, and they're sharing this information with a teen. Here's another example of a team that did an issue on teen pregnancy. Highly visual. You can see the statistics and some slogans and some other issues, right? But they've got a statement down here. But then they also have candy, and here are some of the teens that were actually playing the game that they were asking them to do. So hopefully these two pictures just give you a visualization of what to expect at the Teen Resource Fair. So as a whole team, you will all be contributing to the trifold poster. For details about what's on it, you should see the final project instructions in the Westmore module in Canvas. And the whole team should be contributing to the flyer and brochure, and the whole team should be contributing to the game. And at any one point during the resource fair, any one team member should be able to explain in detail, be an expert about what's on the poster, what's in the flyer, and what's in the game. However, to complete these things, you may want to divide and conquer the aspects. So, for example, is somebody going to buy this poster, and once you've gathered all the information information and printed it. Somebody's going to glue it all on and show up with the poster. Somebody else makes the color copies and designs the brochure. However, all of you contribute to the information in it. And then maybe somebody else buys candy or prizes and gets the game together for the teens. So divide and conquer aspects to make it more streamlined. The second component of the final project research that you all need to consider is that each of you are finding at least 2 research articles from the peer-reviewed journals. And separate from the project that you do at the Boys and Girls Club, you will be submitting personal inquiry journals for each. So that's an individual part where you write up and reflect on the research articles after you've read them carefully. So just as a reminder, when we did the library research with Mary Beth, we went into the e-resources databases that you have access to, and we focused on using Academic Search Premier. And what I want to remind you of is that you should be looking for full-text articles from peer-reviewed journals, roughly years 2005 or later, even earlier than that, 2010 or later would be great, but 2005, the last 10 years would be good. And remember that in your search criteria, you want to use words like teens or adolescents. And if you can find any United States statistics or even any statistics in Arizona or data that pertains to Arizona, even better. The more localized and focused you can find research and data, the more you're going to connect with the teens that you interact with. So the next part of this screencast, we'll talk about the structure of a research article, and it's pretty heavy and pretty long, and I'm going to be toggling back and forth from a research article as an example. So if you need a break from this information, or if you want to go back to the beginning and review the first part of this before you continue, pause this and do that now. The structure of a research article includes an abstract, an introduction, the methods of the research, the results, a discussion of the method and results, and then some conclusions or findings and references. And the terminology for some of these pieces typically stays the same, especially methods and results and discussion. But sometimes introduction can be called background. Sometimes conclusions can be called directions for future research. So these are general terms, and they typically hold standard in most research articles, but as you're finding data, as you're finding research, that may change, and I don't want it to throw you. So the abstract of an article is a summary of the key points, and a lot of you, when you were doing your library research, were finding these things. It's a brief explanation. It's usually 100 words or less, and the first thing you want to do is read the abstract. If the abstract doesn't sound like something intriguing, don't print it. Don't move on, because you want to find research to fit your needs. Once you've found an article, an introduction gives you background of the study, typically also the context and the prediction of what they studied. There's also a literature review typically in this section of research that has come before that has been meaningful or informative to the research in the article. And it can be long and lots of times not necessarily need to be read in its entirety for purposes of this final project. And then the methods describes the study, and it gives you important information regarding the who, what, how many, where, when, length, how they conducted it. And it's definitely an important section. It needs close reading, and you'll actually have to describe the methods in your personal inquiry journals, so pay close attention to this. The results. Data is typically summarized in this section, and it's often very technical. And unless you are a fan of stats, know a lot of stats, or in stats class, these sections can typically be very confusing because they talk about things like analysis of variances and chi-squares and regression modules. And unless you know statistics, none of that I just said made sense. And then the discussion. The results are typically discussed in a narrative form, and they typically revert back to some of the information from the beginning. And it'll talk about how the study was successful or how it could be refined or changed for future research. And this is also to be read carefully for important results and conclusions. And then lastly, the rest of references. References can be very helpful because if it's a really good research article, you can typically use the reference list to find other articles on the same topic. And I do that repeatedly for the research I do as a professional. Okay, so how do we read this stuff? What does it look like in real time? So let's look at a little bit of that right now. So the first thing we're going to do to read a research article is read the abstract for an overview, read the first paragraph and the last paragraph of the introduction, and then go to the discussion. So what does that look like? Well, if I go to the article that I picked up from Academic Search Premier, you'll see that this article is called Dating Trajectories from Middle to High School, Association with Academic Performance and Drug Use, from a peer-reviewed journal, Journal of Research on Adolescence. So I was instantly interested because that term, that search term, that's really important to this work we're doing for the Teen Resource Fair is right in the journal title. And right here is the abstract. So I have to read this, right, and see if this is interesting. Now, I've already done this and know that this abstract is actually an interesting piece. So essentially, it looks at dating trajectories from 6th to 12th grade and describes academic performance and drugs. So essentially, after you read this, what it says is that students in these two groups that identified for dating trajectories and drug use had significantly worse study skills, were 4 times more likely to drop out of school, and reported twice as much alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana use than students in the low and increasing dating groups. So the study highlights the diversity of not only dating trajectories, right, but some of the risks associated with early dating. So I thought that was really interesting information to share with teens. So now if I do that, now I have to read the introduction, which is right here, right? And when I read this, right, I think I want to go a little bit further because I noticed that the second paragraph in this introduction starts with, in the United States, dating during adolescence is developmentally expected. So that's sort of like a social norm that I want to think about. But once I get into this, right, over here, I'm kind of done. But I do like that idea. Now, the other thing I need to pay attention to is the very end of the introduction. So notice I'm scrolling down a couple of pages and I see, method, right? So the introduction must end somewhere over here. And sure enough, this introduction ends with a literature review, and instead of having the hypothesis in the introduction, they have a paragraph on the current study. So I want to read that, right? So as stated right here, it's a paragraph, and it says, involvement in romantic relationships and high school completion are 2 salient developmental processes for adolescents. Few would argue against the importance of graduating from high school. To our knowledge, no studies have used yearly evaluations to examine whether adolescents follow distinct trajectories from middle to high school in relation to dating, and to investigate the association of these trajectories with academic outcomes. So they use 2 indicators of academic outcomes, high school dropout rates and yearly teacher-rated study skills, as independent measures of academic interest and effort. And there's the research that suggests that early dating is related to lower academic achievement. So if you get involved in a relationship at the younger part in middle school, your grades go down. And then they frame this within the problem of behavior theory. And they examine whether dating trajectories were associated with the 2 indicators of problem behaviors, particularly drug use. So they hypothesize, there's their hypothesis. This is their question that they used in this study right here. Will follow different dating trajectories from 6th to 12th grade, and that students who start dating early will have a higher high school dropout rate, worse study skills, and will be more likely to use drugs than students who date less frequently or start dating later. So armed with this information, I can now read the method and the rest of this article pretty closely because I know what it is about. Okay, I'm going to end this first screencast here, and part 2 will talk about the second half of reading a research article.